Hey there, we'll be doing a reaction analysis video on a mock interview that I did with Amit for an Amazon PM interview. These Amazon PM interviews are often quite different in that they're very behaviorally focused. So I'll be giving my commentary and feedback throughout the interview on how Amit handles one of these more behavioral type PM interview questions. I'm excited to share with you a little bit more about how I, as an interviewer, think through this interview. Without further ado, let's get into it. Tell me about a time that you solved a pain point for customers.
So just to give you some context, my first job was with a startup called Chai Point in India. This was a chain of tea retail stores, similar to kind of what Starbucks is here. We were trying to do it with chai in India. And I was leading marketing there. And as part of marketing, one of the goals that I had for that quarter, or one of my important goals, was to launch a mobile-based loyalty program. And in order to do that, I wanted to understand what are the kind of features we would build. So I was doing some user research. In order to do some user research, I was visiting stores. I was talking to customers in stores. And one of the things that I identified was that while a lot of customers felt that a loyalty program would be good, I realized that there were some much deeper and bigger pain points they were having with the core experience, their experience in the store itself. And that was that the queues at the store were just huge, especially during rush hours. And so that's the problem I identified. And here's what I did about it. The first thing that I did was really try to understand what was happening. Was it an operational issue? Was it like a training issue? So observing what was happening, talking to a few customers, and just being at the store, I realized the big pain point was payments. There was a lot, like payments were taking a lot of time. Like just to give you a sense, the average ticket size was like 50 cents in US terms. So so we didn't have credit card or debit cards at that time. And most of the people were paying using currency. And at that time, digital payments were not popular. And there was a big problem of tendering change at that time. So that was creating a lot of chaos at the counter.
So we're diving into this problem. Amit's done a great job of sort of setting the stage. This is always really, really helpful to just set context for the person listening. A lot of times people will jump into behavioral interview questions and say, hey, this is the problem, this is what I did. But as an interviewer, if I don't have the right context, I won't be able to know why this decision was made or why it was challenging or why it was hard. This is often known as the first letter of the STAR sort of behavioral framework, the situation. So Amit's painting a picture of what the situation looks like. And then sort of like a great story, he's set up a problem. He said, this is the situation, but then I noticed this problem with the queues. And so Amit's also kind of telling the story in an interesting way that makes me curious. Like now at this point in the interview, I'm wondering, okay, what is the issue with the queues? And let's find out.
And really, we were aware that something like this was happening. I didn't know how bad experience this was leading to. With that insight, I kind of went back to my team and I discussed that, you see, this is the problem. This I feel is like a much bigger pain point. And is there something we can do with the loyalty program? Can we try to address it? And one of the team members at that time proposed, how about launching a digital wallet? How about where customers can come and pay using QR codes? And at that time, just to give you a idea, like this right now, it's pretty common payment using QR codes. At that time, it was a completely novel concept. No one in India at that time was doing it. But I did more research around it and talking to my team and doing some understanding from the engineers, how feasible it is. I realized we can develop something like this, something of in a basic format. And it would have been very hard to develop a few years before, but now it's more easy to develop. So got an understanding that this is something that could be done. And next I went to some more senior stakeholders in the company. I was reporting to the CEO and they were the CEO, everyone involved. And I proposed to them look, this is a much more serious pain point. And after talking to my team, I realized that we can actually, rather than launching a loyalty program, we can actually build a payments app where customers can load money onto their wallets, digital wallet, and pay much more quickly and efficiently. So yes, there was some reluctance on their part. It was not easy to persuade everyone at that time, but I aligned slowly. I worked through their whatever their concerns were, and I was able to align them. And the result was that I was able to convince them to launch a pilot in one single store. So for 2 months, we built a very basic MVP, if you can say, and launched it in just one store. We were tracking a couple of metrics, like how many people downloaded the app and how much it reduced the average transaction time. The result of the pilot was after about 6 weeks that we got about 1,000 downloads at that store. For the pilot, it exceeded what we were expecting. And the wait time came from 40 seconds to 20 seconds, the app on average. And Then we rolled this app across all the stores over the next 6 months. And within a year, 25% of all the company's revenues were coming through this program. So not only this helped solve a big customer pain point, it helped shape the whole direction and digital strategy for the company for the many years to come. So this is a story that I wanted to share, and happy to go into any of the elements that you want to discuss about.
Totally. Well, thanks for sharing that story. Really fascinating, different take on a type of story in general, and sounds like it had a really big impact on the team, which is awesome.
Thanks. Yeah.
So I guess you mentioned convincing stakeholders. I'd love to dig a little bit deeper into that. Like, how did you go about persuading people that the idea that you had was the right one for the product and for the team? So now Amit's painted the full picture. So he's gone through sort of a rough sense of the STAR framework, the task, the action, and the result of this particular situation and how he resolved it. He did a great job of mentioning specific metrics throughout. He did a great job of mentioning his specific role in it as convincing stakeholders and getting them on board with it. And he also clarified a very clear pain point and answered the actual problem that we're talking about as solving a pain point. One thing that I definitely was missing from that is the solution. So there was a part where Amit is talking about, hey, I'm thinking about the QR codes, or someone on my team proposed it, and then we jumped very quickly to Amit proposing it to management and making that final decision or making that final persuasive argument. I was missing sort of how Amit thought about it or analyzed the problem and decided that this was going to be the solution. As you can imagine, there's many other ways to solve the problem of a queue. For example, having more queues. You can split up the queue into multiple lines or something like that. And so it's not quite clear to me that that was the right solution. We'll definitely have more of a rich conversation about it afterwards, and Amit did a great job of creating that space. So I think what he did is, after he sort of went through the overall scope of the problem, which is always quite effective, is to kind of go through the full thing in a very brief manner and then say, hey, I'm open to any questions, or would love to dive deeper on the areas that you thought were interesting so that I can talk about them a little bit more. If Amit didn't want to say the thing up front about how he solved the problem or how he came up with that solution, he could have even just said, I'd be happy to talk more about the solution, but ultimately we ended up deciding that the creating our own payments solution was going to be the best route for solving this problem. Happy to talk more about the justification for that, but I want to talk a little bit more about the metrics. So he could have kind of included that a little bit more when there are sort of these gaps in the story. Again, you want to take the interviewer through the logic that you went through to come up with that solution. So you want to kind of guide them through that and have them come to the same conclusions and understand how you came to them as well. That's just part of persuasive speaking. So let's see how Amit handles sort of the second part of this, which is more of the free form conversation that happens after the initial answer to the behavioral interview question.
So there's definitely a lot of uncertainty. Even I was not sure that this was the right idea and it was something that would work. I would say, like, at that time, the stakeholders, like, everyone was aligned that this was an important problem. They also, to their credit, felt very excited that, this is something that's new and they wanted to test out something new. The genuine concern was, at that time, there were two concerns. One was like, will people actually use it? There was no precedent. Like, no one was using QR codes at that time for payment. And like, we were not a big chain, we were like a small startup doing something. So will people really use it? That was their concern. And the other big concern, which was, I think, a much bigger and real concern, was that all these solutions had to be integrated with POS, the point of system, the billing machines in the stores. And these are really bulky, heavy software. Like, I remember, their downtime was 30%. 30% of the time, the machines would never be talking back to us. It was down. Like, so the concern was like, if this doesn't work, this might actually end up creating even worse experience for customers. So these were all really important points. And the way I thought about, like, the way I resolved those concerns was, first, like, in terms of thinking, like, how do we get people to use it. I propose, like, I don't know the answer to that, but what we can do is actually launch a small pilot. We'll not know until we do that. So we can do a very, very low cost pilot. I've talked to my team, and like the app should not take more than about 6 to 8 weeks to build out the simpler version. And we can make it really low risk. So we can just roll it out to 1 to 2 stores. They felt like this seemed like the right strategy. So I was able to get people on board about this. The second one, it took me a lot more. I had to do a lot more homework on the second one to solving the complex technology piece. I had to talk to the POS providers. I had to understand, like, I had to actually convince some other people in finance to upgrade the POS infrastructure at store. So we bought better machines, we installed better Wi-Fi, we installed better software. So there was some cost involved in doing so, but because everything was just at a small scale, at a pilot scale, people were not really concerned about like shelling out a lot of money. So
got it. So the pilot sort of helped you be the canary in the coal mine to figure out whether or not this is going to work, and then you scaled it up.
Sure.
I guess I'm curious to hear a little bit more about. So you ran this pilot. Were the metrics really good when you ran it? Is that sort of what was convincing after that?
Yeah, so we were tracking 2 metrics, as I was saying, like number of people who download the app, to give a sense of, are people willing to use the solution? Do they think that this is something that will be helpful for them? And second was like how much it reduced the average transaction time, how much it reduced the actual problem of waiting, of payments. So was the solution really working at all?
So Amit's now described some of the problems that he had in getting this project approved. I think what is really effective about this is he's sort of describing just like the intricacies and the work that he had to do in order to make this happen, which showcases his ability. Again, these behavioral interviews are about showcasing your skill set to the interviewer. And so Amit's doing an effective job there. There was a point at the end where I just summarized kind of what he said, and I do wish that Amit had included that summary himself, just to make it a little bit easier for me to digest and understand that. So sometimes if you do go for a long period of time talking, it's always helpful to pause and just give a 1-second summary of, hey, this is what I just mentioned, or this is sort of the conclusion of that, like, of this pilot in this case. But yeah, let's keep going.
The way it happened, the way it evolved over those 6 to 8 weeks was that there was a very strong high adoption. Like, this was a good enough problem, and we were able to come up with right messaging, that there was a lot of downloads. But I think it took us some trial and error to get the average transaction time to get down from 40 seconds to 20 seconds for people who were transacting. There were some difficulties we faced, but we solved them through iterations.
Can you tell me a little bit more about what those challenges were and how you solved them?
Sure. So some of the simple challenges were, like, this was 2015, I guess, or 14. I don't exactly remember. So it was some time back. And one of the challenges was, like, we didn't anticipate. So this needed internet connectivity on users' mobile phone to work. And there were some people were working using 2G at that time. And so those were some of the things that I didn't anticipate. And because of those lags, it was taking a long time. And so one of the things that we had to do was, like, as a temporary solution, install Wi-Fi devices at stores. But also there were like a lot of minor UX issues. Like, it was the onboarding experience was really cumbersome. There was so much friction, like, for people to load money, for people to like create accounts. So we simplified all of that. And that took a lot of iterations. Like, doing those minor changes was something that we fixed over that course of that time.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. I guess I'm also just curious, you mentioned the metrics that you evaluated. Like, what sort of, like, can you tell me about the role of metrics in launching this product, and maybe some metrics that weren't as useful that you thought were going to be useful, and why you picked the metrics that you picked?
Sure. So I think we picked like a bunch of metrics to pick. To answer your first question, why we use metrics was, I was very clear going into this that this is an experiment. That's how I convinced everyone that, see, this is going to be an experiment. And when you run an experiment, you need to either, at the end of the experiment, you need to tell that, you were able to prove or disprove your hypothesis.
So before we go into the metrics conversation, I'm asking these follow-up questions that are definitely unexpected for Amit, right? It's not like we rehearsed these beforehand, and definitely in an interview, you would have no sense of what the interviewer is going to ask you. I, as the interviewer, I'm just poking around to get a sense of, how did Amit think about this problem? Can I understand the solution a little bit better? Can I understand, the analysis a little bit better? And it truly is up in the air as to how the interviewer will take the interview. Amit's doing a great job of sort of calmly and coolly answering these questions, giving a sufficient amount of detail, but not going in too long to rant or ramble, which is one of the main issues in interviews. So I think Amit's length of his answers are really effective. And he's also just sharing a little bit more detail about what happened. There's some levity there. There's some reflection there as well, which is really, really helpful as well. And ultimately, interviews with behavioral interviews especially are a little bit more just conversational in nature. You're chatting with the interviewer, catching up with them, seeing what questions they have. Now, in just a moment, I'm going to dive a little bit deeper on the metrics part because that was something that was interesting to me about what Amit talked about, and then we'll have a more rich discussion about that one.
So metrics played an extremely important role, and we said okay, we are going to look at these 3 or 4 metrics, and we are going to say that if we get more than 500 downloads, that means the solution is working. So that was exact. And we defined a metric and we defined certain threshold. And those thresholds were I didn't build huge data models to come up with what those thresholds were, but it's based on some quick estimation, how much traffic we were getting. We said okay, based on the traffic that we were getting, if 10% of people would download the app, that's good enough for us. So that's how we kind of defined the metrics and their thresholds. Some of the other metrics that I was also tracking, I wanted to track was around how frequently people would be using the app once they downloaded it, what the ticket size on those metrics would be, how much are they spending, what's the revenue that we would be getting. So I think those were useful metrics to track just to keep an eye on. But in terms of proving this hypothesis wrong or right, those were not as useful as the first 2 that I talked about.
Got it. That makes sense. So I guess maybe just a tangential question I have for you, Amit, is if you were to redo this experience, what have you learned and what would you do differently from how you launched that?
Yeah. I think I'll just say something that I feel, I'll start with something that I feel we did well overall. I think was just to kind of show we didn't waste a lot of time in terms of designing, experiment, or thinking a lot about it. We launched it quickly and we got it off. I think having that bias for action was extremely important, and that helped kickstart this program.
So before we go into, I'm going to talk a little bit more about a tangential question to this. Amit's conversation around metrics was interesting. There were a few elements that definitely stood out to me, right? So if I'm an Amazon interviewer and someone was just picking a metric for 10% without much justification, that might be concern, given Amazon's scale and size. But also considering that this is a small startup, that makes a lot of sense. You have to kind of pick these goalposts, and there's a lot more finger in the air of figuring out what makes sense. So I think it's something that Amit could have leaned into even a little bit more, and just mentioning hey, at a big company I might consider many more factors when considering the metrics that I pick, but at this company we picked this basically just to get a sense of if it's working. I think his point about experimentation is also really, really astute and gives an insight into how he thinks as a product manager as well. Experiments, ultimately you do need to measure metrics to determine if an experiment is a success or a failure.
Having said that, I feel I could have done a little bit more research around thinking about all the edge cases, things that can go wrong. So for example, one of the things that I had not anticipated about were potential security concern or fraud scenarios that could come up. Once this experiment started, what we started seeing was that because people were loading money on their digital wallets and then using QR codes, some customers started taking screenshots of their QR code and started circulating it. And I had not at all anticipated that. And that led to some fraud cases, that led to some difficulties in accounts reconciliation at the back end. And so going ahead, I would still like to operate at that pace, but at the same time, think about certain edge cases, think more exhaustively around what can go wrong. Even if I don't intend to take action or build a solution for them in the first version, I'd just like to keep that in mind and keep everyone informed about that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's hard to catch all those things, but it does sound like an insight there is just learning that you can anticipate some of the challenges earlier on, as opposed to finding out last minute.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I do want to start to get towards the feedback section, but if there are other points or interesting areas of this story that you'd like to share, would love to hear any other aspects of it before we have like a couple minutes before we move on to the feedback part.
So Amit's doing a couple things really well here. First of all, he's demonstrating the Amazon leadership principle of bias to action. For Amazon in particular, it's always really, really important to show that you're knowledgeable about the leadership principles and weave those into the answers that you have. And we have more guides and lessons on that specifically. But the other thing that Amit's doing, he's also just demonstrating humility and thoughtfulness. When asked a question about, how you may have made a mistake or how you might do some things over again, it's always helpful just to be honest and candid and say, hey, I wish that I had checked out these edge cases a little bit more when I had thought through it. And that's certainly an aspect of having bias to action, is that oftentimes you will run up against some of these problems. So I think one thing that I'm assessing for as I'm listening to this is like, how is Amit to work with? Is he a nice person to work with? Like, does he have humility and respect, and is he thoughtful about the products that he launches? But does he also have some of those leadership principles as well that we're looking for in the Amazon interview process?
I think we covered most of it. I think this is one small thing which I feel like helped me align stakeholders more closely, and it's to do something with the understanding the human element, behind what goes on building these kind of products. So one of the things that I knew was the CEO who had the loudest voice amongst everyone. He was a big fan of Starbucks. And what I knew about, and when I was doing my research, is Starbucks had launched something like this. And knowing that, if I presented that story to the CEO, he would be persuaded a lot to kind of develop it and like back this. So understanding what motivates each of those individual stakeholders help you kind of move the product vision ahead. And that's a lesson that I've carried on even in later products that I have worked on.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Was there something specific that you did that you want to share about knowing the intent of the stakeholder that you positioned really well?
So he loves Starbucks. He talks about Starbucks all the time. And one of the things that I did was actually talk to him about, like, just share some data around what are some of the metrics around this program was, around Starbucks loyalty program was, how many users it has, what are the features it was using. And I think that kind of convinced him that this is a similar direction we should also follow. So just sharing that data was like kind of pushed him a little bit in that direction.
Got it. Totally makes sense. All right. Awesome interview, Amit. We can take a deep breath and sort of transition now from the interview stage into sort of just talking about the interview and talking about how it was for you and maybe any tips and things like that. So before I jump into some of the notes that I wrote down about what made this interview really, really awesome, I would love to hear just a little bit of your self-reflection. What do you think went well? What would you change within this interview?
So in this part of the interview, Amit is, first of all, taking an opportunity to share a little bit more about something that he knows was a strong suit of his in this particular project. But second of all, I think it's a really clever conversation, and it demonstrates, again, Amit's perspective. He's saying, hey, I know how to empathize with stakeholders. I know how to persuade stakeholders effectively. And that's something that I would do on a team that I join. And again, throughout this interview process, Amit's done a lot of things where he's mentioned aspects of decisions he's made or personality traits that he's had, which gives me a better picture of, okay, how would it be to work with Amit? And I'm coming away from this interview feeling really excited about, hey, Amit's a really smart, thoughtful guy, very humble, and open to admitting mistakes, and learned a lot. He's also very good at persuading stakeholders and empathizing with people. He's really effective at identifying pain points and driving towards solutions for those. And I think he's also just demonstrated conversational prowess. He's able to talk through some of these problems effectively and communicate effectively, which is always really important for a team. So overall, I think this was a really strong interview. I think there were a couple aspects where I might have added a little bit more detail, or really thought, if I had to give one piece of feedback for this interview, it would be really empathizing with the interviewer and bringing them along the journey that you go through when you solve a problem. So give them all the right pieces of information so that they can come to some similar conclusions with you, and you're sort of hand-holding them through this particular problem that you're solving. But ultimately, I think Amit did great. And I hope that this reaction and analysis video was helpful for you and getting better and acing your interviews. So as always, good luck with your upcoming interviews.